Hey guys, if you're like most of us and you don't want to work the rest of your life and you suspect that investing might be the answer to having your money work while you sleep, then stay tuned. You're in for a real treat. Up next is your crash course in Investing 101. So stay tuned.
Inspire the best version of yourself with tips and skills you can implement right away. Look, it's a mind, body, and soul connection, and we all know that when we feel better, we do better. Your future starts now.
Hey everybody, my name's Michelle Rohde and I'm your local financial advisor and wealth coach. And as promised, today I want to teach y'all about the basics of investments. And there is so much information out there, I know, when it comes to investing and all the different investments out there. Everybody seems to have a different opinion about what you should do, why, when, how, where. But I want to cut through all of that confusion and just make it really simple for you today and just teach you that the basics that are true no matter where you go, what you do, or who you talk to, these basics don't change. And it's just foundational information that you need to know if you're going to start investing. And so to get started, let's go ahead and look at the investment pyramid to kind of help you make better sense of all of the different investments out there. So I hope this helps. I drew you a little chart because I think sometimes pictures help sometimes to put things into perspective. So as you can see here, I'm going to get a little closer so you guys can see. I just drew your typical triangle, your pyramid, and over here I have a category called equities. Down here, another category called stable or cash, and then another category called fixed income. These are your three main categories or asset classes of investments that you have available to you out there. There's a fourth one that's become more popular recently since the Great Recession called alternatives, and I'll go over that in just a minute. But for the most part, all of your investments fall into one of these three categories here. And what's important for you to know is that they all serve a different purpose and they all act a little differently from one another. So let's start with the asset class on the bottom. Sometimes people call this the cash asset class or stable value. And they call it that because it does provide a stable value. So you want to think about your money at the bank. So you have a checking account, you have a savings account, maybe you have a money market account where you're earning a tad more interest. Those accounts are meant to preserve your principal, to keep it safe in case you need it soon. So that account there is really not meant to make you a lot of money. Those type of investments are just meant to preserve your principal. You're not going to have a lot of interest. Your principal's not really going to grow, and you're not normally going to keep up with inflation, which is close to 3% in these accounts, because these types of accounts, cash, savings, money market, and so on, typically, and especially right now in today's environment, earn less than 3%. Okay, so let's move on to the next category, fixed income. Again, it's pretty self-explanatory. It provides a fixed interest rate on your principal. So these are investments that you can also commonly get at banks or brokerage firms. Sometimes banks have brokerage firms in them. That's becoming more popular. Some insurance companies offer investments now, and there are quite a few brokerage firms that are standalone as well. So you can get these investments at a variety of places now. So fixed income, some examples are CDs, which stands for certificates of deposit. What you do is you deposit your principal and they give you a fixed interest rate in return for as long as they hold that principal until the maturity date at which point you get back your principal and you've earned a small amount of interest for that time frame. And your principal didn't fluctuate much, if any, during that time frame. And then there's bonds. Bonds are typically the work the same way, except you're giving them your principal for typically a longer time frame. And because of that trade-off, you're going to get a little bit higher interest rate usually. And there's a lot of different kinds of bonds out there. Some bonds most people are most familiar with are savings bonds, because maybe your grandparents gave you some savings bonds, or to save up for college. They're very common to give kids. They're easy to get at your bank. But some bonds that may pay higher interest are corporate bonds. Municipal bonds offer tax-free interest. There's government bonds like the double E savings bonds you may be more familiar with. And then there's also UITs, which stands for Unit Investment Trust, which are bundles of bonds. And there's other instruments in that category too. But these are the most popular and the basics for you to be familiar with. And what you need to know about these is that they strive to keep your principal relatively stable also, just like this category down here. But they will typically return a little bit more interest because you're tying your money up for a little bit longer, and it's not as liquid as the money down here. So for instance, you can take a withdrawal usually fairly easily on these accounts without a penalty, without many restrictions on them, and without having to worry about your principal dropping. That can be said for the most part here. You don't have to worry about your principal dropping as much as it would in the stock market. However, there may be a penalty to get your money out of some of these types of investments here, because they are paying you a higher interest rate while they use your principal. They may leverage it and use it for mortgages to lend to people for loans at the bank, for example. So they need to have that security. Okay, so the third category is equities. Equities are investments that have the ability to grow your principal, and some equities even also pay dividends or capital gains. So your money can grow two ways. The interest can go up on it, or the dividends, and your principal can also increase. However, these types of investment, while they can return much more, they also carry a higher risk. So the higher the return, usually the trade-off is the higher the risk. So usually, on average, we've learned by watching the stock market over time that 1 out of every 3 to 4 years, the stock market's going to fall. So that's a risk with this category. You can have equities through stocks. Real estate is also considered an equity. You can own stocks or equities inside of mutual funds or ETFs, exchange traded funds. There's a variety of types of equities out there. It's just important to know there's a trade-off here. The higher the return, usually the higher the risk, and vice versa. The lower the return, the lower the risk generally. Now, there are different types of risk, and that's a whole nother show. There's purchasing power risk, there's inflation risk, there's interest rate risk, there's political risk. So we're just talking about the risk of your principal fluctuating here in this particular scenario. But these are your 3 major asset classes, and depending on what your particular goal is, it's important to know what your goals are. You may have an emergency fund goal. You may have a goal of saving for your child's college education or your own education. You may have a goal of saving for vacations or for your own retirement or saving up for a house. Depending on what your goal, depending on your age, and depending on your personal level of risk tolerance, will dictate what percentage you need to own of each of these categories. And the answer will be different depending on your goal. So it's important to have a financial advisor walking you through that scenario and asking you those questions to determine what your goals are, what your time frame is, and which investments you need to own in what percentages and what types of accounts. So you don't have to know it all. But this is just Investment 101 to get you more comfortable with the concepts so that you feel a little more confident when you're having the conversation. But don't be afraid to ask questions and to seek help. A lot of times advice is free. So again, don't be afraid to ask questions. And I hope this has helped you make a little bit better sense of what's out there. And then that fourth asset class we call alternatives. There's a lot of things in this asset class, from derivatives to hedge funds, commodities, and futures. And what they do is they're supposed to, it's another asset class that is supposed to act differently than all of these. So for example, equities and fixed income have an inverse relationship. What that means is when the stock market is rising, when the principal value of stocks are going up, the bond values may be going down on some bonds, especially longer term bonds or bonds that have a lower rating that are higher risk. So they have an inverse relationship. Also, when interest rates start to rise, as they have been, sometimes your bond values can decrease as well, depending on the type of bond. So it's good to own different types of investments in your account. You don't want them all going up at the same time or all falling at the same time, most importantly. So it's good to have things that have inverse relationships. And that's why alternative asset classes have become more popular, because in 2008, 2009, when we had our Great Recession and everything kind of fell at the same time, which wasn't typical, alternatives were some asset classes that may have performed well when everything else was falling. And then also, though, transversely, alternatives may fall when these are rising. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket in terms of investments necessarily, and depending on your goals. Sometimes just one asset class may be appropriate if your goal is just to have an emergency savings fund. So anyway, it's good to have that conversation with your financial advisor. Find which asset classes that you need, in which percentages and what type of accounts, and go from there. But if you'll have any questions, or if there's anything else you've been wondering or want to know about, just let me know, and I'd be so glad to help you out. Bye.